Thank you. Just to introduce myself, as Barney said, we know each other through separate things as well, which is really nice, and it's really good to bring two worlds together. That's great. I've lived in Southampton since 1969, when I came down to go to university the first time, so I'm not in the first flush of youth. But over the years, I've done things like social work training, and I was a social worker for many a long year in the city and in Hampshire and in Portsmouth. And so I know the area quite well. And I'm not like your average student. I'm a sort of a local resident, which I think is a bonus in terms of understanding the local area, which is really important, I think, for my topic area. So the topic is citizenship and digital social contact adaptation by older people before and after specialist memory assessment. If I try and go to the next slide. The aim of the research, and I can perhaps as I go through explain what some of the terms mean in this kind of context, is to find out how older people with dementia adapt their use of digital communication for social contact before and after memory assessment and diagnosis. So I'll be working with older people, and for my purpose, that's people over 65, and there are different definitions of what older people really means, but I've kind of slightly arbitrarily chosen 65. It's older people with dementia, and I'll come on to what dementia is all about shortly, and it's about adaptation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, the way that people adapt their use of digital communication and their use of social contact. So digital communication is about using IT. It might be a desktop or a laptop or possibly a mobile phone or a tablet for digital social contact. And I'll be looking at what happens before somebody has a memory assessment and then after they're diagnosed. And in order to do that, I'm going to be looking very closely at people's experience. So this is I'll mention it again shortly, but it's qualitative research rather than quantitative. So why is it useful? I think it's potentially useful for all sorts of reasons. Now, some people who did some work a few years ago now and are still doing it, Bartlett and O'Connor, but particularly Ruth Bartlett, who used to be an associate professor at the University of Southampton. I think she was a nurse by background. She's now gone to become a full professor on the basis of all of the success of her work and her ideas in Oslo, in Norway. She and Deborah O'Connor were looking at opportunities to grow and to participate in life to the fullest extent possible. For me, that helps inform their idea of citizenship. That's being part of what's going on in the world. If you develop dementia or other disabilities, you tend to be perhaps taken less seriously as a citizen. You are less fully a citizen. And I think that if we can explore the way the digital social contact takes place, we can help to sustain citizenship. The Department of Health produced a policy document, the National Dementia Strategy for England in 2009, which aimed to promote the idea of living well with dementia. So it kind of took a slightly different standpoint on dementia from that which had taken place previously, so that people were seen as being entitled to receive the kind of moral support and the practical support that goes with living as well as possible with dementia. Now, that's not to say that dementia isn't a condition that does cause suffering, because of course it does, and getting that balance right is very important. Costs is a major issue. So in my view, if we can help people to retain digital social contact in general through the digital world, for instance, then that will be beneficial in terms of helping people retain a position in the world, and will mean that the kind of support they're given is better and easier to provide. and there'll be a cost reduction. A few years ago, there was an estimate of a total overall cost for supporting people who have dementia in the UK was £11 billion or so. And the World Health Organization projects that by 2050, the total cost across the world will be $2 trillion. It's a very rough estimate, of course, but it shows you the kinds of costs that are involved. And a lot of those won't be affected by this work, but it might be that it will make a contribution to helping reduce costs a little. Social contact is really important in relation to health, and a couple of authors I've mentioned there have identified that if you retain social contact, then you have a healthier life. And amazingly, you can actually reduce the mortality, so that the likelihood of somebody dying is reduced by retaining good social contact. I'm also very hopeful that this work will help to inform the way that professionals carry out their jobs. So doctors, nurses, social workers, and so on. And it could indeed help inform policy in the widest sense. We carry on to the key concepts. I've mentioned citizenship already. So citizenship, in terms of promoting it for people with dementia, includes ensuring participation, freedom from discrimination, the opportunity to grow, amongst other things. And grow can be in a whole range of different ways. If we think in terms of people like Terry Pratchett retaining the ability to write and to write in new ways after having received a diagnosis of dementia, then that's one of the ways that that can happen. So I've already mentioned dementia as an idea. The World Health Organization does produce a definition in ICD in 11, I think it is now, International Classification of Diseases. So it includes things like Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and a whole range of others. In fact, I think there are some very rare ones. In fact, there are probably about 100 different types, I think. I've mentioned people being assessed in relation to their memory and their ability, their cognitive abilities. So GPs, if somebody contacts a GP to say, look, I think I've got a problem, and that might be the person themselves, or it could be a family member bringing the person who has a difficulty along to chat to the GP. GP is very likely to refer on to an older person's community mental health team to say, could you please assess this person? And they will do that. And that arose originally out of the National Service Framework, which is an old set of ideas now, but the way that was set up to happen is still operational in terms of the way that assessment and diagnosis takes place. So somebody will be referred for assessment, will be assessed, will either have a diagnosis of dementia or they won't. So quite a few people are actually diagnosed with a condition called mild cognitive impairment, or there may be something else that actually is causing the problems that have been identified that the GP needs some specialist input into, and it may be that some treatment can be prescribed. But if once a diagnosis has taken place, the person will then need to respond to that. Now, part of that response will be about social contact and connectedness. So it's about how people experience their social world, and having dementia will have an impact on that. And the set of connections they have, the relationships they have, will be impacted by that. And the attitudes of other people will change. And that will change slightly in the period up to assessment and diagnosis, slightly beyond. And then as time goes on, the process of adaptation will develop, and people will adapt in different ways and at different speeds. And then they'll respond to different things that happen to them in the real world. So in order to answer my research questions, which I haven't shared with you, but they arise out of the aims. So the methods I'll be using will be qualitative rather than quantitative. So because although we know a fair amount about what happens to people in all of the key concept areas I've talked about, we don't really know very much about how people adapt in the digital world in their social contacts. If they have either the symptoms or a diagnosis of dementia. So this is qualitative exploratory work. I'll be using a methodological approach called IPA, which has nothing to do with Indian Pale Ale. It's actually interpretative phenomenological analysis. And basically, it's a way of analysing the results of semi-structured interviews. You can use it the other ways, but the way I'll be using it is using semi-structured interviews. So I'll sit down with people who have dementia or who have been referred for assessment, and I'll have a set of questions that I want to ask them. And with the IPA approach, I'll be very keen to allow them to take things off in slightly different directions. So if they come up with something that I haven't thought of at all, I'll be very pleased. But clearly, if people have dementia, then they may struggle to think their way through what's going on systematically. So having it as semi-structured rather than as completely unstructured is quite important, because I'll be able to help them keep the focus of what I would like to talk about in mind. I'm going to repeat it up to 3 times. So I'll have the first interview after the referral to the Older Persons Community Mental Health team, then another one after they receive a diagnosis. If the people I really need to focus on are the people who receive a diagnosis of dementia. So I'll make it very clear from the very beginning that the first interview may or may not need to be followed up by a second and a third interview. So I want to see how people respond to being given the news that they have dementia in terms of their social contact and the use of digital devices. And then I want to interview them again 4 months after that. So they won't have probably progressed too far in the severity of their dementia, but they will have had a chance to adapt to a new set of circumstances. And I want to see what happens there. I'll be using a small sample, so I want to end up with something between 6 and 8 people who go through the whole course. I'm in contact with Southern Health and their research and development section and their memory assessment and research centre at Moor Green. And in fact, I'm meeting this afternoon with a psychiatrist who I'll be following up again with to work out how we proceed with the recruitment process. I'll be involving study partners. So I'll say to each person that the Older Persons Community Mental Health team sends a pack of information about what this research is all about and how they can contact me. I'll be saying, could they please involve a study partner? That might be a friend or a relative who will help give moral support to them during the interview process. And I'll also, as I'd agreed with the NHS Research Ethics Committee when they gave me ethical approval for this, I'll be assessing the mental capacity of people who are potential participants, and at each point that I interview them, to be clear that they have the capacity to make the decision about whether to participate or not. So there'll be genuine informed consent. So the next steps, as I say, I'll be meeting with people this afternoon and ask the older people's community mental health teams to tell possible participants about the opportunity. They'll send back a little slip to me to say, could I have a chat with you about what's involved here? I'll send them through the consent forms and the participant information sheets for both the participant and the study partner. And if they want to proceed, and if they have the mental capacity to make the decision under the Mental Capacity Act, I'll interview them up to 3 times, as I've already discussed. And I'll then transcribe recorded interviews into Word documents and feed them into an IT system that's kept secure. So I'll then analyse and interpret those interviews, identify the key themes that come out of that, identify any learning and messages that might follow, and work out. I'll either do it myself directly, or it may be that there are people in the participant group who want to be part of that. We'll communicate the results to those people who need to know. And if I just click through to the last screen, that's the references that I've used for this. So I hope that all that makes sense. I'll be really interested to answer any questions and to hear what your thoughts are about this whole project.